Welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. Tony, are you alive?
I am alive.
That's good to hear.
You know, I joked last time, like, we should do like a over-under, like, is Tony sick this week? Well, it turns out I got very sick this last time. I think it was COVID.
Yeah.
Something like COVID. But a weird thing happened where after, like, I was kind of on the recovery rebound, you know, like fever had subsided, the body aches had gone away and whatnot, my calves started to get sore. And I attributed it to just, like, you know, being on the couch in the bed for, you know, a week straight. But, you know, I was texting you and you were like, hey, you should try these lymph drills.
Right.
And so I thought, you know, maybe we should talk about that for a quick second before we get started, because I thought that was pretty interesting.
Totally. Yeah. It's actually pretty relevant to today's topic too. But yeah, that set of lymph drills I sent you, like, we'll have to do a podcast at some point on the lymphatic system. But basically your lymph system is, you can think about it as like your plumbing system or like the sewer system of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all based on like fluid dynamics and how your body can, you know, rid itself of waste product.
Mm-hmm.
And it can get stagnant, right, for a variety of reasons. And obviously when you're sick, your immune system's working hard to, you know, beat the bad guys and eliminate them and get them out of your system. And part of the way that your body does that is, you know, via the lymph system. So you can have like stagnation when you've been sick, and sore calves just made me think that maybe you were having some lymph stagnation. That's why I mentioned that and sent those drills over to you. I've been actually doing quite a bit of lymph work myself because I'm still working through that dental stuff that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
So like the left side I had work on, and now I've had work on the right side. And so I also have been doing the lymph work to just help things along and, you know, help with optimal fluid dynamics. And I find it really helpful. It's so stupid simple, some of the ways that you can get your lymph system to start doing its job better.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty cool when you do these things and they work. Did you play around with the drills?
Yeah, so I did the drills. So for the listener, you know, basically you do some light massage and taps in a sequence in a specific order for these different lymph systems. So you go through about like 6 different spots on the body. It takes 2 minutes to do it. It's really hard for me to know, because at the same time I had been recovering and I started going for walks outside, and like just things were kind of going on the up and up. So I just don't know like what it was. Like, was it those drills that you know, helped out, or was it something else? You know, was it just time or sunlight or But it definitely feels like it improves circulation.
Yeah, it's with that stuff, it can be a pretty subtle result, or it actually can be fairly drastic. It's interesting. Like once you start getting your lymph system moving again, if things have become stagnant, you can actually feel worse before you feel better. Like when I started doing it, I was doing the lymphatic mobilizations like 3 times a day. And initially I was having like waves of feeling better and then feeling not as good, and then better and then not as good. And that's fairly typical when you need that work. Sometimes it can be subtle. You're not really sure if it helped. For me, like if I start testing ranges of motion and stuff, because I'm interested to see like how my body's responding to it, I'll often get a lot better ranges of motion, especially if my like low back is feeling kind of achy. That's like another good reason to use the lymph stuff, is if you have just achiness with no injury event or, you know, no reason to be achy. Yeah. Sometimes getting the lymph moving can actually wipe out that achiness pretty good. So yeah, it's different for individuals, you know, based on why you're using it, but you can even have like little detox responses happen. Like when I first started, and this was like post getting the dental work done, I got a little skin rash between my index finger and my ring finger on my right hand. And like I woke up and I'm like itching it, and then I looked down and I'm like, oh, I got like a little rash there. That's very unusual. And then I was like, oh yeah, I started getting all this lymph going again. And that went away very quickly. But those types of things can happen if you're having like a little detox response. So it's pretty interesting.
I did have like a little welt on my like abdomen was
Really?
kind of itchy, and I was like, that's weird, and it went away. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
one thing I noticed was like I was just really tired,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt like before and after the lymph drills, I would either get more tired and then feel energized after, or the
Mm-hmm.
other way around. I would feel energized after and then get like tired again.
That's interesting.
So I don't know if it's related, or again, it's hard to know, right? Like,
Well, it is, but it's funny because I've been doing this. I've been dedicated to doing lymph work now a lot.
yeah,
And one of the things that I just learned is not to do it late at night before I go to bed because my
interesting.
body's response to it late at night has been a little bit, I guess I would call it sympathetic.
Hmm.
So if I do it during the day, I feel that it's quite energizing in a good way. But for whatever reason, doing it late at night just before bed actually gave me that feeling of, well, I don't really want this right now. I want to be feeling like I'm
Yeah.
going to sleep and, more of a parasympathetic shift.
Hmm. It's almost like eating right before bed, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
getting something moving around in your system when you're supposed to be shutting down.
yeah, yeah. So I just learned through trying it 2 nights in a row, and I was like, you know what? I don't think this is the right thing for me. Like right before bed. So now I've just been doing it earlier, and
Hmm.
it's much better. But it is interesting to notice that and to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, I guess what I didn't think to do, and this is a good lesson for everybody, is I didn't choose an assessment
Mm-hmm.
to do before and after,
Mm-hmm.
because that probably would have been good information to have, like a range of motion thing,
Yep. And if you're just doing it because you're sick, it's tough to have an assessment. Again, like ranges of motion might give you feedback if you feel achy and restricted, which I
Yeah.
often do when I'm sick and my immune function is compromised. I lose mobility basically.
Yeah.
Man, especially when I had COVID. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I had neural tension all the way down my spine into
Mm.
my sacrum and hamstrings and stuff. But I mean, when your immune system is compromised, you certainly can feel achy and restricted. So that could be a reason to use range of motion assessments just to kind of see how things are responding. But yeah, if you don't have that, then it might be a little bit challenging, and you might just use kind of your energy in the moment as an assessment.
Yeah. I mean, I will say my calves are no longer sore. It lasted a
Nice,
couple of days and it's gone now. So
cool,
that's a win.
yeah,
Quick question about this and then we'll move on. But I
yeah.
do think it would be cool to do maybe an episode at some point. Do you do these drills like as soon as you start getting sick, or do you wait for recovery? Because it sounds like it can be kind of taxing on the body. Like, do
Hmm.
you choose your timing or do you just do it?
When I get sick, honestly, I just throw in the towel a lot of times. I'm really just resting. And then, you know how you get to that point where you're like, man, I'm ready to finally go outside and get some
Yeah.
sunlight and take a walk. When you get to that point, usually involving some of this lymph work is actually a good thing. That's kind of the point where you want to start doing it. Could you use it leading up to getting sick if you feel low immune function? We kind of always, if you're in tune with your body, I mean, I know at this point, I know 2 days before I'm getting sick.
Yeah.
Like I just know. And I actually don't have a lot of experience. Have I ever just been like, oh, I'm going to start doing this lymph stuff and see what it does? I haven't really approached it that way.
Hmm.
I think you could, but I don't know really what kind of effect it would have. But it's reasonable to think that it might be a good thing to do.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, you mentioned something interesting. You said what was the segue I was latching onto? You had neural tension
Yeah.
and this lymph work was relieving that for you. There's a lot of talk about the vagus nerve
Hmm.
and how you could possibly reset the vagus nerve to maybe have a similar effect. So I'm really curious about what you think about this. This whole episode, if you didn't read the title before it turned on, is going to be about the vagus nerve. So I thought that might be a good place to start our conversation.
Totally. Yeah. There's a lot of language now going around. People are getting really, really excited and interested in the vagus nerve, and for good reason. There's a lot of emerging research coming out based around the vagus nerve. There's been a lot of really interesting books written somewhat recently on the vagus nerve, and people in different arenas and spaces are, getting getting really interested in it because we're starting to learn that the vagus nerve is incredibly important. There's a lot of language that goes with that. And of course, anytime, like anything, especially in health and fitness, when something becomes a little trendy, if you know what I mean, the pendulum swings, right? And so the language around the vagus nerve is honestly getting a little weird. And that's probably just because people are overexcited about it and don't fully understand it yet. And, we do hear a lot of things like, okay, we have to reset our vagus nerve, in order to calm down or whatever it is, whatever our goal is. And that kind of language, I don't like that much because you hear people saying you got to reset your nervous system for this reason, reset your vagus nerve. We're sort of thinking about the neurology as like a switchboard. And all you have to do is hit the switch and turn something off. And neurology doesn't work that way. So with applied neuro, you're always trying to essentially turn one dial up and maybe turn another dial down. It's all about like maintaining balance. It's not as easy as just turning a switch on or off. So I understand what people mean, I think, when they're saying like, hey, we gotta reset the vagus nerve. I think in most cases, people either mean activate it or possibly activate it to get a type of down regulatory response in the body, which we call parasympathetic. Because we're going to talk about the vagus nerve and how it's one of the largest drivers of parasympathetic activity for our brain and body. So you're not going to hear me talking about resetting the vagus nerve. That's not a thing, right? There's ways to target the vagus nerve. There's ways to train the vagus nerve for sure, but we're not resetting it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I'm a bit of a Star Trek nerd, and Data is one like the robot guy, and he's just got a button that turns him off. That like it's super secret, nobody knows about it. But of course, like the bad guy finds the button and just turns him off. So that's what I was thinking of.
You were a Star Trek guy. I was a Star Wars guy.
Yeah, it's the dichotomy of our generation, I think.
Yeah, true.
But okay, so yeah, let's rewind then a little bit on this conversation. And how about we talk about like what is the vagus nerve? What's it doing in the body? And then we can get more into how to activate it or why. Yeah,
totally. We'll start with some basic anatomy. So the vagus nerve is the longest of the cranial nerves. So it's a very, very long nerve, sometimes referred to as like the wandering nerve because it's super long, starts in the brainstem and just kind of winds its way down through the midline of the body. And it affects a lot of important stuff. So it originates in an area of the brainstem called the medulla. And, as it winds its way down, it's got lots of branches that are affecting lots of organs. So I'll kind of graze over some of them just so people can get an idea of the types of structures in the body and organs and areas of the skin that the vagus nerve actually supplies. So as it makes its way down from the medulla, like we've got branches that actually supply the connective tissues on the posterior part of the cranium. So that's like what's referred to as like the meningeal branch. Okay. And that's like, it's supplying like some sensory for that area. Okay. Which we probably will come back to during the conversation because that already presents some interesting training applications for some of the tools that we like to use. So we've got some sensory innervation there for the connective tissues on the posterior part of the skull. It also has branches that innervate some specific skin areas on the ear, which is really cool. And this is pretty new. This is pretty new. And there's a lot of research being done around what is called auricular vagus nerve stimulation, which is basically, I think most of the studies are based around electrical current and using these specific areas of the ear, producing electrical current, and then studying what it does to the vagus nerve. Also presents some amazing training applications for us. that I've used in a number of different ways that we can talk about at some point. But
yeah, I've got 1,000 questions already. But
yeah, it's cool too, because there's actually, when I say new, what I mean is we're now starting to recognize its application and importance. But things like auricular acupuncture have been around forever, where, therapists have been putting needles in people's ears for a reason for a very long time. And it might seem weird, but some people have had amazing results from getting auricular therapies to their ear, like just putting needles in the right spots. And this is evidence why that might work. Yeah, so we'll come back to that, because there's that whole skin of the ear thing is really cool and important. So as it continues down, it actually supplies the carotid artery. Okay. We've got relationships to the pharynx and larynx. So think about swallowing, think about talking, speaking, right? These very important survival-based functions. And if you think about the branch that's hitting the carotid arteries, that's because the vagus nerve is intimately involved in cardiac responses and blood pressure, right? So important stuff.
Yeah, now I'm seeing the connection with the parasympathetic system.
There you go. Yep, there you go. So involved in, electrical impulses to the heart. It's got innervation to the lungs, the esophagus, the stomach, the gallbladder, the pancreas, spleen, kidneys, intestines, and liver. So that's a lot of important stuff.
That's like all the organs.
That's like all the organs. It's a big nerve, and it's directly supplying all this important stuff. So how can we ignore it, right? It's pretty cool. So the vagus nerve is one of the primary drivers for parasympathetic activity in the body. So for our listeners, parasympathetic meaning more like a rest digest kind of shift in nervous system activity, versus sympathetic, which we kind of always talk about as like fight or flight. So for example, when you're preparing to eat food and your body's, knows it's time to get ready to digest that food, or it's time to get ready to go to sleep, right? Or you are just kind of shifting to a more parasympathetic state. That's for good reason. That's that rest and digest kind of shift that we want to make for doing those things. And your vagus nerve is driving a lot of that activity.
Yeah. So when we talked about neuromechanical drills, one of the things we talked about was all the different points of activation, right? And you went through how every joint has multiple, goes different directions, and then you can manipulate it at different parts of the chain to get different effects, right? So immediately I'm thinking, all right, if you can simulate your ear to do something with the vagus nerve, that is connected all the way down to the liver.
Yes.
And you have all these different points of activation that could potentially be connected.
Bingo.
If I'm barking up the right tree here, is that sort of how you think about it in terms of applying stimulus and when to do that?
Yeah, so there are lots of tools we could use, and we'll go into some other anatomy too that gives us at least really good evidence of what we can do to affect vagal tone, right? Affect the vagus nerve. But that's exactly right in your thinking. It's not unreasonable to think that way and go, okay, if I have a digestive problem, right? And I know that the vagus nerve is largely involved in driving parasympathetic activity so that my digestive system can work the way it's supposed to. Can I think about it in terms of like, hey, could improving vagal tone or activating the vagus nerve a certain way with a certain tool potentially increase digestive function? And the answer is yes. And that's why it's so compelling, because we want solutions and tools to be able to deal with internal health problems. And the vagus nerve is going to be one of those main structures that we want to be targeting in order to do that, for all the reasons that we just discussed in terms of its direct anatomy. So yeah, you absolutely can think that way. You know what might be a good thing to do is let me kind of just list off some possible history findings that might, because we're getting a lot of health and movement professionals starting to listen to the podcast, and going over history findings might be a useful thing for them because you want to be able to recognize this stuff in your clients. But I also want to do it because some people have no idea that the vagus nerve might be important to them, and perhaps something on my list might change that for them and get them thinking differently. So there's so many things, and I was trying to condense it. Obviously, when a nerve like the vagus nerve innervates almost every organ in your body, there's going to be a lot of history findings that potentially go with that. The first one is any kind of history of breathing problems. It could be asthma, right? Or something related. Any kind of breathing dysfunction, you're definitely going to be wanting to think about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is actually an anti-inflammatory pathway for the body. So that in itself is very interesting because, like we were talking about being sick, right? Anytime you have chronic inflammation in the body or even poor recovery, which is important for our athletes to hear, because I'm going to be kind of listing off some things that people are going to be like, oh, those sound like health issues. But even poor recovery is involved here because the vagus nerve, being an anti-inflammatory pathway, is the most important nerve for the speed and quality of your recovery. So it's not just about, a health problem necessarily. So poor recovery, chronic inflammatory issues, any kind of digestive issue, chronic reflux. There's a lot of people with reflux. Vagus nerve matters there. The type of thing where you hear people say, I'll eat a meal and then I feel really full and uncomfortable and I can't really lie down on my side for 4 hours because I feel like the food's going to come up, or I get heartburn, right? Those are all the types of issues that really matter here. Irritable bowel syndromes, just again, like digestive difficulties, even blood sugar issues, people who are struggling to find balance with their blood sugar just because of the vagus nerve's influence on like the pancreas and stuff, that can be involved. Liver issues, depression, anxiety, low immune function, any kind of autonomic dysfunction. So just kind of thinking about blood pressure. Actually, I have a story at some point I'd like to tell about a client I was working with for several years who had some really very obvious vagal tone issues and some really interesting autonomic dysfunctions to go with it. Cardiac issues, right? Anything going on with your heart, right? You can't ignore the vagus nerve. Inappropriate autonomic functions, which is kind of what my story is about. And even emotional blindness, if you want to put it that way. There is a really interesting connection. I don't want to go into the weeds too far on this episode because honestly, there's probably a whole nother podcast on this idea of interoception. But you can't talk about the vagus nerve and not mention interoception. And what that means is interoception is your sense for understanding what's happening inside your body, right? So when your stomach growls because you're hungry, you feel that and you might know what it means because you've had practice understanding what it means. It's our interoceptive sense that allows us to feel that and understand what it is. So any kind of internal process, anything, right, is going to have a large interoceptive component to it. And there's a brain area called the insular cortex, which is the brain area that we're actually most interested in when we look at the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve is sending all of its afferent activity to the insular cortex. So the insular is like the home of interoception. And the vagus nerve is sending a lot of that interoceptive information to the insula.
So is this also backed by the meninges?
No, so it's the insular cortex it's a very interesting brain area that honestly it's being talked about a lot more as of like the last 10 years. Before it was just sort of this area that was hidden in the middle of the brain, and you couldn't see it. Like if you think about your typical diagram of the brain where you see the cortex and all of the lobes that a lot of people are familiar with, like the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, right? The insular cortex is hidden. So that may be one of the reasons why it didn't get a lot of press for a long time. But basically, if you were to kind of peel back the temporal lobe, underneath that, you would eventually see the insular cortex.
And that makes sense with the name, like it's insulated.
Yep.
Like it's,
Sure does. Yeah. So what I was saying about like the emotional stuff is when you study interoception, our emotions are directly involved with interoception. So people that have vagal issues might have some interesting emotional difficulties, whether that's like a body disassociation. Like some people just, they don't feel like their body is their own. I actually had someone on Instagram contacted me in my DMs yesterday or the day before. And they're like, hey, thanks so much for your content. This is making so much sense. Someone's finally talking about the brain. I don't feel like the left side of my body is mine. What does that mean? And I was like, oh, do you mean like you don't feel coordinated? Because I hear that all the time. And it's not uncommon to have like one side of the body less coordinated than the other. She's like, no, I don't feel like it's mine. And I was like, oh. And so in my mind, I'm going, this is an interoceptive deficit. Yeah. I talked to her a little bit, and what she does know about herself is that she has I don't even know if I want to call it super significant, but she has a vestibular deficit that was found by a clinician. And she told me about the assessments that the clinician ran on her. And it sounded legit. Like it sounded like good, solid assessments. And I think that she has a fairly significant vestibular issue for somebody that I would still consider like a generally healthy person as far as what I know about her. We'll talk a little bit about the vestibular connection to this whole thing, because
as soon as you said ear, I was like, is it inner ear?
Yeah, so it's yes and no. Yes and no. Really what it comes down to is that this insular cortex is a very complicated area where it's kind of an information hub where a bunch of different inputs, it's receiving information from a bunch of different inputs, not just the vagus nerve, for example, but also visual input, auditory input, and vestibular input. It's an association area where a lot of information coming in is being compared with other information. And then there also happens to be like in part of the insula, there's, I think what we would call it is like an association area for vestibular input. Needless to say, without going too far in the weeds there, because of the relationship between the vestibular system, the inner ear, and the insula, and the vagus nerve supplying all the information to the insula, you see that people with insular deficits often have strong vestibular issues too. And because everything works like a two-way street in neurology, you got to ask questions like, could a vestibular problem cause interoceptive deficits? And could interoceptive deficits cause a vagus nerve problem?
Right.
Or could a vagus nerve input problem cause an interoceptive deficit? And could you develop balance problems in vertigo and motion sickness, or just, even just non-serious vestibular deficits, right? Because everything's a two-way street. So that's the part of neuro that I really find fascinating, is that when you understand the basic anatomy, you can start to trace those things and ask some questions like that. So we've got vestibular relationships there. We've got emotional relationships there. The insular cortex is, the health of it is one of the things that helps us feel emotionally grounded. So for our health and movement pros, again, like when you're hearing somebody talk about a body disassociation, where they feel like a limb or any body part is not theirs. You can even pick up on it in people's language. Some people will say, the leg is not feeling good. Like, it's funny to think about it that way, but like Someone who does not have an interoceptive deficit and they've had like a knee injury or something, they will talk about it as their knee, like my knee. Somebody who has more of a disassociation to that body part, and maybe they've had some long-term interoceptive deficits going on, they might start calling it the leg.
Yeah.
Or this leg. It's really fascinating. And I see that all the time and hear that from people. I've even had clients tell me, I don't feel like my body is mine. I had one lady tell me, I feel like I'm a head on stilts and my head is in the clouds. And I'm just walking around through life. And basically what she's saying is physically, I feel ungrounded. My body doesn't feel like mine. And go figure, those people usually struggle with feeling emotionally grounded as well. So this whole thing of interoception, its connections to, all the different tissues in the body and also emotion, very fascinating, probably a whole podcast. But again, you can't talk about the vagus nerve and leave out the insular cortex, right? Last thing on my list is how many times, as health professionals, we hear someone say, I'm deficient in vitamins and minerals, and I've had these different tests done, but nobody can tell me why I'm deficient in vitamins and minerals. And then when I go and do the work that I'm supposed to do, giving myself those things, my tests come back and the results are the same. And it is possible that the vagus nerve, if you have vagal issues, can be quite involved in that.
Is this like because of digestion, like you're not properly assimilating nutrients? Or
yes, that could absolutely be part of it. It's a little heavy, and it probably goes into an arena I don't know enough about, but it is a common finding. It's a common thing you'll hear from those people.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So a clue that maybe the vagus nerve can be a target. So
totally.
On the one hand, I feel like there's so many very specific things that clue you in to this system. But on the other hand, if there's so many organs involved, there's several different brain areas involved. It touches the vestibular system as well,
right?
The interoceptive system. It feels also like it could be a very useful blunt object. So to follow that thought, going back to the original popular idea of like, oh, we need to reset the vagus nerve, I'm getting the suspicion that there are some global potential benefits to activating the vagus nerve that, maybe you don't know where the digestive issue is or exactly what's wrong with the vestibular system or why the breathing is, not optimal. But giving this system a nice workout and getting it to connect to the brain and to the other parts of the body in a healthy way could have all of these great downstream effects.
It could. And the way that you describe that is the reason why this is actually such a difficult thing to understand in terms of its application.
Yeah.
Because think about it. Almost everything that we listed off, and I left out tons of stuff. And by the way, chronic inflammatory issues, chronic pain issues, things like fibromyalgia that are very mysterious still to people, all the weird stuff. Basically, think about every single thing that evades healthcare, right? All the things that people are trying to get help for that evade healthcare, that they struggle to get help for, and then they find themselves on a pharmaceutical drug and hope that that's going to do something that they needed to do. So basically, all the problems that evade healthcare are vagal, which is like, whoa, full stop. Like, if we can figure this out, this could be good. And I really do think that where health is going in the future is, the vagus nerve is going to be there. Like, there's a lot of stuff coming out, a lot of great information. There's a lot of gadgets coming out on the market where you can buy these devices and they're not even considered medical tools right now. This is so new. Anybody can buy them for direct stimulation of the vagus nerve. Things are happening. There's a ton of compelling evidence that this could be good, but because of like how you were just describing that, there's different ways we can approach it. But the reason why it's actually very difficult in its application is because of how all the global effects on the whole body that the vagus nerve can be involved with. Plus, like I was talking about with the insula being kind of a hub for all this different input coming in there. The question then becomes, can we make the difference we want to make with an isolated activation?
Right.
And I don't think we have an answer for that yet, but I'm going to talk about some of the stuff I've been messing around with.
Yeah.
Because it is absolutely applicable. It depends on the goal. And this is an important thing to discuss because there's kind of two ways to think about this, because there's a lot of people out there talking about using vagus nerve activation to kind of downregulate, or stabilize the nervous system. Okay. And that's a valid idea, because we know that if we stimulate the vagus nerve, we could have a parasympathetic effect over the nervous system, and that is more calming in nature. The question then becomes, can we use something so isolated and target to have more global effects? Or do we have to figure out how to make the stimulus extremely strong? Which might mean that we're going to put together training using a variety of different inputs that still have to be targeted, but we need to create a strong enough training stimulus to affect the vagus nerve and the insula the way that we want to. The reason I bring this up is because you got to know what you're trying to do. So, for example, could you use vagus nerve activation for calming your nervous system and helping you deal with some fight or flight type of responses? And this is something that I get questions about this a lot, like on Instagram. Recently, somebody wanted to know, can I use vagus nerve activation for dealing with my chronic fight or flight? And the answer is yes. What you generally read about and see other people doing are very isolated activations. So just so our listeners know, here are some ways that you could very easily activate the vagus nerve. Humming, literally humming, like a deep note, right? You'll feel like your throat kind of vibrating as you create that humming based on the innervation that the vagus nerve has and some of the muscles there in the throat. And the vagus nerve also supplies a portion of the tongue, right? And so humming is a way to activate the vagus nerve. Now, could you use humming, right? Multiple sets of humming, maybe 25 seconds at a time, and possibly create enough activation for the vagus nerve that you then get some parasympathetic responses. Maybe you feel better. Maybe you feel like your sympathetics are not so high. The answer is yes. The response will vary from individual to individual. And that's why we assess and we reassess. And so humming is a tool.
I'm immediately thinking of like monks, doing like those hums and chants and like kind of that meditative.
Totally. There's a ton of practices. There's a lot of old practices that involve humming, singing, chanting, right? For good reason. There's going to be a lot of vagal responses that come from that. So there's some other things, right? There's exercises with the tongue, right? You've seen some of my stuff on Instagram. I've got tons of tongue drills, basic isometrics with the tongue circles, okay, is one I actually just recently created some content with that, and that went wild because the tongue is an unbelievable structure for creating changes in the nervous system and muscle tone. It's really wild. And so we've got a lot of things we can do with the tongue as well that would be possible vagal, stimulus. Okay. So there's some simple tools that we can use to create more of a parasympathetic shift. And going back to originally when I was talking about the meningeal branches of the vagus nerve supplying the connective tissues on the posterior part of the cranium. It's one of my favorite tools, actually, and it's amazing for people. We have a whole series of drills that we teach in our courses called cranial mobility drills.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially the goal with a cranial mobility drill is to kind of similar to a nerve glide. You position your head, neck, and sometimes your jaw in a very precise way. And then you drive a mobilization with a very precise movement. The goal being to put mechanical tension on certain parts of the cranium.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got different suture areas that we like to try to bias with creating the right position. We've got some areas of the posterior part of the cranium that we try to target. And one of the reasons why cranial mobility drills may be so effective is because of that innervation, because of the vagus nerves supplying some of the sensory components to the connective tissues of the skull.
Yeah.
It's going to be really powerful stuff. And there's also a lot of ancient practices that use, manual manipulation, somebody doing this on your body to the cranial area, And so that's another great training tool that we use is cranial mobility. There's lots of them. We can keep covering those. But the point being, you got to know what you're trying to do. Are you trying to take advantage of a stimulus that's going to be used in the short term, like humming, like a tongue exercise, maybe a cranial mobility drill? And are you going to try to use that to elicit some parasympathetic activity? That's a very valuable thing to do for people, especially if you're trying to help them decrease pain, decrease those fight or flight responses. You could even say it could be part of a routine of, trying to, help someone with a digestive problem.
Mm-hmm.
So we got that idea. Now, this is kind of where my focus is more, because I know that just from experience now that some of these more isolated activations for the vagus nerve, they don't go as far as we want them to go unless they're done in combination with a lot of other things. This is why you got to start to know your anatomy, because it may be because of the global effects that the vagus nerve has on the whole body. It may be that because it goes to the insular cortex, which is a information hub for integrating all sorts of input, that we need to combine more types of stimuli to make this work go further and to make it more powerful. And that's kind of where my belief is right now. I still use these quick, simple vagus nerve activations all the time with clients because there's reasons why you might want to do that, like even improving movement. So just yesterday, I was on a call with our membership. So I do a live call every week. And we were talking about brainstem stacking, which means utilizing a specific cranial nerve, activating it for a reason based on a movement goal. And so one of the ones we talked about was the vagus nerve. And so you can actually activate the vagus nerve very quickly and see some impressive improvements in movement. Oftentimes it happens to be movements that are more about flexor tone. And that's a whole different thing because some of these cranial nerves have a bit more, when you activate them, they have a bit more dominance to either flexor tone or extensor tone, which is cool. So, we were talking about how do we use this in kind of a very quick way to help us with a movement goal. So that's a very practical tool. Now, for people that have more like longstanding health concerns, they have more of these internal issues. And, we find that vagus nerve activation may be helping them with those things. We got to start thinking bigger in terms of putting more types of stacked stimuli together.
Right.
And that's why it's important to know your anatomy and all the things that actually matter in terms of, the insula. Because I kind of am at a place now where I think we can make the biggest changes in vagal tone when we understand how to put these tools together. And that's what I've seen in my practice with individuals. So you just got to kind of know what you're trying to do. Are we calling on activation for a very specific, quick, goal with movement or pain? Or are we trying to create training for the person where now we're training the vagus nerve for improving any kind of health condition in the long run.
So one of the questions that I saw come up when you posted about an episode about the vagus nerve was the idea that like my vagus nerve doesn't turn on, or I need to turn on my vagus nerve. Hearing you talk about this now, I'm wondering, is this just like kind of similar to the idea of like clarifying the map? Like perhaps there's these fuzzy spots along the way that, you know, you need to activate in order to train that connection, and then clarifying the map could resolve some problems here.
That's exactly right. That's a really good way to think about it. Again, you know, for the person that's saying I can't turn on my vagus nerve, your vagus nerve is working, right? But yes, like you're saying, perhaps there's a map clarity issue. Okay. And, you know, map clarity issues with vagal tone are generally something that, you know, just take place over time. Or maybe, you know, you're born with some kind of health condition and you start to develop more, you know, vagal issues as you age. But yeah, so map clarity, you know, with our training, that's a large part of what we're trying to do. And it kind of comes back to the interoceptive stuff and the insular cortex again, because what we do see in individuals that have kind of long-standing interoceptive deficits is that they can either be hyper aware of certain functions in their body, certain parts of their body. For example, being hyper aware of your breathing, being hyper aware of your heart rate, being hyper aware of just your body, right? Those are the people. I know my movement coaches out there will know what I'm talking about. Have you ever had the client who is so fixated on their body when you're teaching them a movement that all they want to do is talk about what you're asking them to do? And they tell you every single thing that they feel along the way to the point where you can't get anything done. And then they finally get to the point where they're doing the movement and they do it. And then they tell you that hurts. Like it's this really difficult cycle to get into with a client because they're so interoceptively aware. They're feeling the things that you're not supposed to feel. Right. And that's what it is to have like heightened interoceptive awareness. And then we can also see the reverse of that, which is more the person with like the disassociation, less body awareness. They don't really understand the cues that their body is giving them. They have a hard time noticing those cues, right? And they even have a difficult time understanding intensity of pain, even. You know, they're not going to tell you something hurts when they're moving, right? They're kind of disassociated from that. So we see that it kind of swings. It can be kind of intense, like the way that swings. And those are all possible vagal issues related to interoception. And it's just interesting to kind of see the difference there in individuals.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we talk about stimulation, I think of like activating, the word activating part of the body or a nerve or a pathway.
Yep.
It feels like exciting, stimulating, like making it do more. But the vagus nerve is related to the parasympathetic response, which is calming us down. It's bringing things down. Is there a tension there where like if you're stimulating parts of the body to try to access this pathway, that it's actually having the opposite effect?
So I guess what you made me think of, actually, this is important to say, especially for our health and movement pros who are doing work with people with trying to create vagus input. It's good to understand the types of responses an individual might be having in the moment that kind of tip you off that you're actually getting good changes in vagal tone. So, and I think a lot of people can relate to doing an exercise and all of a sudden it makes you want to yawn. Right?
I get that a lot.
Yeah. So our cranial mobility drills that I was talking about, one of the common things that happens, especially cranial drills and tongue drills, they generally will relax people in the moment. In fact, when I was teaching cranial and tongue drills in our neuro dojo class, I had like 10 people on the screen I could see during our little drill session. And they all started yawning at the same time. It was hilarious. And so I pointed it out and we're all just kind of chuckling about it. But that's kind of like that parasympathetic shift. It just starts to feel relaxing.
Mm-hmm.
You will notice changes in people's breathing. Breathing will become more relaxed. And if you're a manual therapist and you've ever done any kind of visceral mobilization on the abdomen for people, one of the things that happens all the time is their stomach starts growling.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't even have to be someone else doing that work on you. If you've ever done any kind of just kind of tissue work on your own abdomen, diaphragm release,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. Yeah, one of the common things is your stomach starts growling. That's an indication that vagal tone is changing and things are shifting more to a parasympathetic state. One of the more common ones is your voice will get deeper. I'm not saying permanently, but like in the moment after doing drills that drive more sympathetic activity, your voice literally would get deeper. It's a really funny feeling. And sometimes it actually can be rather intense, and the client will recognize it and like start laughing and be like, whoa, what's that?
Mm.
But that's, again, kind of a sign. Now, kind of going back to what you were saying, can it go the opposite way? Can we accidentally become more sympathetic
Mm-hmm.
from doing what we think is actually supposed to be parasympathetic? That's a great question, because it always comes down to assess, reassess. Because yes, that can be the case. Why could that happen? I mean, simple explanation, maybe the input is threatening in some way. Here's an example. And this is why I have a little bit of an issue with a lot of like people in the space of nervous system regulation right now. Are, everyone's talking a great language. They're starting to use application of vagal stimulation, but they're approaching it as if it's absolutes. Like, okay, we're going to do this humming or whatever to stimulate the vagus nerve, and that's always going to be good for a person.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. So you always have to be able to assess what you're doing to understand if it's the right thing, and then you also have to assess your dose. So could you do the opposite accidentally? And the answer is yes. So I'm going to make this story real fast, but I had a woman who I worked with for several years. She had a pretty significant breathing dysfunction, and she had 5 serious abdominal surgeries, 5 C-sections, some other scars and surgeries too to her thorax. And actually what we see is that people who have had a lot of insult to the skin and connective tissues of the trunk and abdomen often develop interoceptive deficits. We're going to talk about why here in a minute, because I want to, if I forget, see if you can remember and bring me back there. But there's some really important stuff to talk about: the tool of touch and tactile types of sensations on the trunk and abdomen and how that affects the vagus nerve. But this particular woman had a lot of issues there, and we had to do some mobilization for basically everything in the middle of her body. She had a lot of scar tissue, had lost a lot of movement, and her breathing was very compromised. She initially started working with a therapist who was practicing another system that's very popular, and it's all based around breathing. And most of the exercises are based around slow exhalation style breathing. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of stacked with some low intensity isometrics that are basically constructed in a way that they are prioritizing posture relative to their beliefs around posture. Okay, so it's this system that uses positional isometrics with breathing to try to improve posture and to try to improve breathing. And so, long story short, she started doing this work with a therapist, and it absolutely destroyed her. And the therapist, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. She was so bought into this idea that this woman needed this breathing work because there's a lot of dogma behind it, which is not uncommon in our industry with methods.
Yeah.
And the therapist kept pushing her on this. You got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it. Got to master it. Oh, you're just not doing it right yet. Okay. I know you're telling me that you have more pain, right? I know you're telling me you're not moving, as good anymore, but we got to keep doing it because you're not doing it right yet. Long story short, it destroyed her. And so she ended up, she's a friend of mine, and we ended up working together for a while to help her through that. The point being, even though this client had significant vagal issues and interoceptive issues, breathing, particularly the style of breathing that is going to activate the vagus nerve a lot, exhalation based with isometrics, which also is more vagal, was exactly the wrong stimulus for her. But according to this method, she absolutely needed it. But they weren't assessing and reassessing like they should have, and they weren't accepting the client's input on the situation.
Right. Like,
And
hey, this makes me feel like garbage.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
Yep. And that is not uncommon. And I've actually been in that exact same scenario with several other clients mentioning the same system. So the point being is, instead of like being devoted to this idea that if you have these, history findings, right? And we know you need vagal work or interoceptive work, we got to do it this way. You don't really know that. You have to assess and reassess, and you might need to play with your tool set and find the right entry point.
Yeah.
So you can accidentally mess this up.
And in this case, there's a lot of entry points. I mean, from cranial stimulation to the ear to breathing to abdominal massage to
money. Yes.
With the connection to the gut.
Yep.
Is diet potentially one of these entry points?
It is. So diet changes can make a big difference on vagal tone. If you're eating foods that are inflammatory for you, you're getting a threat-based response from it, that absolutely can be a thing. So my wife has been working through long-standing interoceptive and vagal type issues for her whole life. And she's made a lot of progress in the last 10 years because of all this stuff, all these training tools. And one of the things that has been really difficult for her diet-wise is that because of her vagal tone issues, she has been extremely sensitive to fat content, which is kind of an interesting thing. So if she has like meat that happens to have too high of a fat content, that like totally is like blah for her, right? And so that's just one example, but yes, diet matters for sure. And you can affect the vagus nerve by eating the right stuff and accidentally by eating the wrong stuff. Let me circle back to some of the tools, right? Because I want to mention some interesting anatomy regarding the trunk, the abdomen, the viscera. So one of the best kind of delivery systems for input to the vagus nerve is really any kind of tactile stimulation on the abdomen or trunk, which really shouldn't be too surprising to anyone because for thousands of years, humans have been poking other humans in the belly and some like good things have happened, like visceral massage, any kind of tactile, manual work on the thorax, right? It can be really powerful stuff because there's a lot of important things underneath that. And then of course we have the vagus nerve. There is a very specific receptor. So it's a nerve ending called a C fiber. And it's an unmyelinated free nerve ending. And it is one of the things that we're stimulating when we do that kind of manual work on the abdomen and trunk. So that's a way we can train the vagus nerve. So all of a sudden that presents a lot of training opportunities too. It presents a lot of therapeutic opportunities through visceral mobilization, which we've always known works really well. I think right now anyone who's up to date on this is starting to realize that the kind of what we're learning in research and stuff is kind of driving this idea that we don't actually have to do visceral mobilization nearly as deep as we once thought. Can actually get a lot of this done in a very superficial way. A lot of that is because of these C fibers and understanding their role in the types of sensations that they, take in. So one of the interesting, I guess, two of the interesting training ideas that I've used for a number of years now with great success in terms of, helping people with these issues is using an ab belt, which is just those dumb things that you see sold for weight loss.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a neoprene belt with Velcro on it, and you wrap it around the abdomen, and it's going to make you sweat and, bring out that six pack. It's stupid marketing around it. Well, that is like putting a giant piece of kinesio tape around your abdomen.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, we were talking about map clarity issues.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a map clarity issue, in your abdomen, and now all of a sudden you wrap something around your abdomen to create proprioception, you're activating a bunch of C fibers, and now you're sending a bunch of input to the vagus nerve. So those belts can be really amazing for people who need this ongoing. That's the key here. Okay, mm-hmm. This is another important thing. Remember, we can hum, we can gargle water, we can do tongue exercises. Those are quick ways to activate the vagus nerve. But most times, for doing this for health reasons, we need ongoing stimulus. Like, you got to be able to receive hours and hours of stimulus. So putting a wrap around the abdomen is a way to do that. So is kinesio tape on the abdomen, which is a tool that we might use for like scars on someone's abdomen. Again, you're activating a lot of C fibers. So lots of tools, right? There's lots of gadgets out there. There's lots of methods out there with different kinds of manual mobilization techniques. When we direct those techniques at the trunk, right? The thorax, the abdomen, that's a very powerful tool for training the vagus nerve.
Yeah.
The other thing to consider is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm and the pelvic floor are very important structures that we also would include in, this kind of training. So I know our community knows I love diaphragm stretches. We've got different breathing-based mobilizations for the diaphragm. In the Neuro Dojo, I talk about pelvic floor exercises, right? These are very important structures, as well as the tongue. So these are super important things. And then we generally will take them, kind of put these things together to create a strong training stimulus, and maybe even include that vestibular work that we talked about, which can be a really helpful driver for interoceptive input, that could help things out. So there's so many different ways to approach it. It's neat, right? It's neat to think through it. The one I wanted to mention that's very important for people, because I did get several questions recently of like, how can I easily activate the vagus nerve? How could I do this on children? How could I do this on elderly folks who may not have access to doing all this other stuff, putting all these things together? Is there an easy way to do it? And so far, what I can tell you is one of the easiest ways to approach this is through some kind of stimulation of the ear. So going back to the auricular stuff, if our listeners are interested in looking at some neat research, it's very easy to find if you just Google up. It's like electrical stimulation, like auricular, and then electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get several different things. And one of the studies is really thorough and gives some great graphics on the exact point where you could provide some stimulus to potentially activate the vagus nerve. There are several points on the ear at this point that we believe to be innervated by the vagus nerve. Mm-hmm. The challenge is several of them are combination areas where other nerves are involved too. There's one area that I've learned about kind of most recently in the last, a little more than 5 years, that is called the Simba conchae. If I'm pronouncing it right, it's something like that, the Simba conchae. And you can easily Google that up. You'll see that is a very specific area of the ear. And that is the area that I have the most experience with guiding people into drills and using that area. And that is, I believe, where one of the cooler studies had applied electrical stimulation. Mm-hmm. And I won't get it all right because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but you'll be able to easily find this if you want to. Basically, they had looked at people that had rheumatoid arthritis, and they had them provide electrical stimulation via this skin distribution of the vagus nerve. And I think it was only for like 5 minutes a day. I forget how long they did it, but the end result was everybody who did this had significant improvements in inflammatory markers. These are all people that had arthritis. And so then they went, whoa, this is cool. When I learned about that, I was working with a professional athlete, and she's really struggles to recover. Like, recovering is her nemesis. And she's got technology to kind of help her with this. HRV scores were always really low and terrible. And I had her take a vibratory device. We have a small vibratory device that we use called a Z-Vibe. It was originally used for speech therapies, where you could do sensory work inside the mouth and on the tongue. Mm-hmm. And I use it for all sorts of stuff at this point, not just in the mouth. I had her buy one of those, and it comes with a little pointed tip. And I showed her, okay, this is the spot, right? This is the area. And so she started vibrating that cutaneous distribution of the vagus nerve at the cymboconchae for 2 to 5 minutes every night, but only once. And her HRV score started improving. This was longer term, this was over an athletic season. Mm-hmm. But she started recovering better, and she was like, son of a gun, I gotta say, I feel a bit better. I'm recovering. My scores are better. So we stuck with that, and that was a useful tool for her. That was the first experience I had where I was like, whoa, this is really neat, because an investment of 5 minutes a night, and we're getting somewhere with the recovery. So I have had, just so our listeners know, because everyone wants to know about the gadgets, right? I just want to electrocute my vagus nerve and get this done, right?
What can I buy to make this
What
better?
can I buy to do this? Even though all you need is to stare at a visual target, move your head, wrap something around your abdomen, do some humming, do some of my tongue drills. There's so many tools. Everyone wants to just buy something and shock their vagus nerve, and I get it. So here's my experience so far with the gadgets. Lots of them are coming out. We probably don't know enough about it. I think we do know enough about it to say it's generally not harming us. I haven't heard any horror stories. But the companies that are producing these tools seem to be trying to put a patent on a certain wavelength, right? That's theirs. So then they can say, okay, here's our device, and you put it in your ear, and it uses this electrical stimulus and wavelength, and that's ours, so we patent it. And I've had several clients now decide to get these gadgets, and honestly, it hasn't been amazing. I've heard from some people, they're like, yeah, I gotta say, I feel more relaxed. Mm-hmm. Like, cool. That's great. I've had other clients use them and be like, I don't really feel anything. Yeah. So it's still mixed. I think we don't quite understand the wavelengths yet. It's very new, so just keep that in mind. But it doesn't mean it couldn't work for you, because like anything in neuro, man, like some people are going to get an amazing result. Other people, it's not going to be right for some reason. Yeah. Years ago when I learned about it and I read that study, I made my own. I ended up like burning myself like with a little electric shock. And so I gave up on it because I like hot wired my, I hot wired my own electrical TENS unit.
Yeah.
Right. And this is like years ago. And I was like, I
don't
found.
Try this at home.
Yeah.
Kids.
Don't try this at home. I gave up on it because like there was an exposed wire, and then it like touched my ear, and then it burned me. And I was like, all right, I got to chill out on this. But
so that wasn't the desired stimulus you were looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So I went on Amazon and I couldn't believe I found them, but it goes to show you this information has been around for a while. I found these like little earbuds. I got it from like an auricular acupuncture site, and they were these rubber earbuds that they fit perfectly in your ear. They were the shape of your ear, and you could attach your electrical stimulation devices to them, plug them right in. Mm-hmm. I had to hotwire mine a little bit because it wasn't made for that. And I did, and I used it, and I didn't know the wavelength. So I was using like pretty low settings and stuff, but it never worked out. 5 years later, all these companies are coming out with their own devices. There's a neat one out there that is actually, you can apply it to the carotid area. Mm-hmm. And it is supposed to provide direct electrical stimulation to the vagus nerve. So some of them are for putting in the ear. We're starting to see now some of them are for the neck. So it's compelling. Like imagine if you could buy this device, run electrical stimulus to your vagus nerve, and all of a sudden get ahead of arthritis, right?
Yeah.
Or any kind of inflammatory condition. I mean, again, all the stuff that evades healthcare involves the vagus nerve.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the future is exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. You touched on a couple things that I did want to address quickly if we could.
Yeah.
So you were talking about HRV scores for this athlete that was having trouble with recovery.
Yes.
And that was kind of your window into whether this was working or not.
Mm-hmm.
So HRV scores, inflammation, is there a good way to assess inflammatory response? Because at some point it might not just be pain or, I'm especially with like anxiety or inflammation. It's like, how do you assess some of these more squishy feelings?
Yeah. For me as a coach and for what I do, and I'm not getting into heavy technology, and full disclosure, I don't even understand HRV.
Mm-hmm.
Like I get input from some of the athletes I work with, and they tell me like, here's my scores and stuff. I honestly don't care about HRV. Put it this way, every athlete I've worked with who was using HRV scores to understand how recovered they were, guess what they had? Interoceptive deficits. Mm-hmm. So they were using technology to make up for a blurry map. So I feel my role as a coach is to say, hey, you're using technology to make up for a blurry map. Let me help you with that.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying don't use it because it's data, and all data is great if it's helping you. But I like to take the approach of helping an athlete learn about their body more, understand the cues the body's giving them. And for your question, even understand when they might feel more inflamed, right? Kind of helping them with history findings that would suggest that. Mm-hmm. How they feel overall is a very interoceptive skill, right? How do you feel? Some people don't know. You ask them, they're like, I don't know. I'm fine. Like that's all you can get out of them.
Yeah.
People with interoceptive deficits, hey, can you scale that pain for me? Is that a 5 out of 10, a 6 out of 10? Like what? They're like, oh, I don't do scales. Like, excuse me? Like I worked with a gymnast, a young gymnast for years. We had a ball. Great girl. And I always used to poke fun at her because I was like, hey, we're working on your shoulder pain today. Can you scale that for me? Like, we got to know, like, what is that on your scale? So I know if we're improving it. She's like, I don't do scales. You know that. And I'm like, can you just put a number on that, please? She's like, nope. And it just hurts. Can you tell me, like, does it hurt a lot? Does it hurt a little? It just hurts. She didn't know the difference.
Yeah.
And that's a very common thing with interoceptive type deficits. So I am more taking the approach of like, let me teach you what sort of signs and cues your body's giving you that might tip you off that you're feeling inflamed, whether that's achiness in your joints, usually inflammatory, when you're extra inflamed, you feel achiness fairly globally. And usually, just for our listeners, it's important to know, like, you hear people say both my knees, both my hips. Mm-hmm. Now it's both my shoulders. Now it's my low back. Now it's my neck. Oh, it's both my knees again. Mm-hmm. And you kind of see this cycle. Often it's like a bilateral complaint. Those are all things I'd like to teach people so that they can learn. Oh, okay, I might be a little inflamed. Let me focus on some recovery work, do some self-care, do some good drills, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It was really interesting that both of my calves were sore when I had been sick and hadn't been doing anything. And I was like, this is different. This is something I should mention to Taylor.
Yeah, totally.
Another question.
Yes.
So inflammation. So there's a big deal made about anti-inflammatory things, turmeric, ibuprofen, ice packs. How do you think about anti-inflammatories in relation to the vagus nerve in your practice?
Well, when I think a client is dealing with extra inflammation or stagnation, right? Like we opened up this podcast talking about the lymph system.
Yeah.
You can't really separate the lymphatic system from honestly anything.
Yeah.
but particularly like sympathetics and the autonomic nervous system. When your stress is high and your sympathetics are really elevated, that's very constricting for the lymphatic system. And that's typically when we start to get that stagnation. So I try to see that in a client or athlete and then start to utilize tools for dealing with it. One of those tools being teach them how to do lymphatic work, right? One of the super powerhouse things that I've been doing lately in my own just kind of tinkering around and trying new things is I've taken all those lymphatic points where, we would do some sort of sensory stimulation for the areas of the body that have the largest concentration of lymph nodes. And I've now taken our joint mobilizations for those specific areas and I've put it into a sequence, just like what you were talking about, where we first do some mobilization through joint mobilization with the clavicular area. Then we go up to the cervical spine and the jaw. Then we go kind of down near the armpit, the abdomen, like the lumbar spine, the hips, and then eventually the knees. So I try to create tools for people. And then like the story I told about using vibration in the ear. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to try that with that athlete is because they were describing all the chronic inflammatory findings, including not recovering fast enough. And yes, of course, diet comes into it, right? But I'm trying to empower the client with something they can start to do right away that might help them begin to deal with that.
And so for you and your tool set, like turmeric or ibuprofen, these aren't really tools that you like to use. You like to do things from a more manual perspective.
I do. And I think making very good decisions in diet is very important for this.
Yeah.
That's kind of I really don't go there with a client unless I know I'm going to have some time with them.
Right.
Because you need time for that. You need to test out different foods and see how they affect you and how you feel after eating them, which that's, if we ever come back and talk more about Introception, when it comes to diet, one of the things that we like to have people do is keep track of, hey, how do you feel after you eat this food? Most people will say, man, this is so weird. I've never asked myself that.
Yeah.
I know when I feel bad sometimes because it's real bad, but I've never like eaten an apple and then like 20 minutes later been like, oh, full stop. How do I feel?
Yep.
It's, people haven't done that. So what is that doing? That's clarifying a map.
Right.
And then you're learning, how do I feel from this food? What are the signs it's giving me? This is certainly a long-term process, but you can actually learn a lot from it and start to understand the foods that help you perform the best versus the foods that tend to give you those little inflammatory responses. And, now your back's a little achy, or you had no choice but to eat a certain way because you were out of town and you were traveling.
Yep.
And then you come back home and you're like, man, I feel like crap. It must be because I let my guard down and was eating these other foods, right? It's a long-term process, but it's a very valuable one.
Yeah, absolutely. Last lingering question that's hanging in my mind from this conversation. You talked a lot about electrical stimulus in like the head area.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is that because it's more effective closer to the brain? Or would you do electrical stimulus on the toe, for example?
Oh, yeah. So electrical stimulus can be used anywhere you want.
Okay.
Yeah, for really, depending on your goal. So we talked about electrical stimulation of the auricular points on the ear. That might be how we could get to the vagus nerve. I've used electrical stimulation for all sorts of stuff. It's a specific sensation. It activates specific receptors. It travels a specific sensory pathway, right? So there's a lot of reasons why you might choose electrical stimulation versus vibratory stimulation. They're in two different groupings of senses based on like what spinal tract they actually travel. Yeah, but e-stim it's powerful. It's a good one. We're headed into a place now, obviously, where technology is, everyone's into it. This idea of neuromodulation is becoming popular, where basically researchers just want to go and electrocute everything and see what happens, and just send electrical stimulus. It's going to be really interesting to see what we learn, over the years, because it's going to bring up some really fascinating things. Because one of the things I kind of learned recently is that depending on the types of sensations you use to do whatever it is that you're doing, it is possible that when they eventually reach, for example, like the parietal lobe, that's the brain area where a lot of these sensations are processed, it is not out of the question that as things are processed, it gets to a point where your brain can no longer tell the difference between A or B sensations.
Mm-hmm.
So that is fascinating in itself, because this idea of like neuromodulation, like could we just provide electrical stimulus in the right place at the right dose to the right structure and make some really profound changes, if we can drive it to the right place, that help a lot of things.
Yeah.
Just because if the sensory part of that eventually becomes indistinguishable from other things, that could be powerful. Interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big takeaway for me, is that the vagus nerve being connected to so many different important organs and important parts of the brain, it explains some connections that I wouldn't have understood before. Like immediately, I don't actually know if this is the mechanism by how it works, but electroshock therapy for depression. Immediately, I can think, well, maybe that has something to do with the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic system and decreasing that anxiety response or something. It might not be actually what's happening, but there's a lot of explanatory power here for things that were seemingly unrelated before you understood, what this nerve is actually connected to.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I got one last thing here, actually, that I think would be valuable to talk about for a minute, because people also want to know, how do I assess my vagus nerve to know if I even need this? And we have some assessments. I will say that with vagal stuff, your history findings are probably the most important. So for our health and movement pros out there, you're going to probably collect more information from your history findings, but we do a test called the test, where you can have someone open their mouth, just like when you were a kid or something, going to the doctor and they have you open their mouth and say, have them tilt back a little bit. And what you can do is actually look at, and I teach this very detailed in the Neuro Dojo, because in the Neuro Dojo, we go over how to test all the cranial nerves, right? So it's, looking at the vagus nerve is important there. You have someone tilt their head back and you evaluate. So if you look inside the back of their mouth and throat, you essentially see two arches, right? And then you see like the little thing hanging down in the middle.
I always think of it as like a
punching bag, a speed bag. Yeah. Yeah. The speed bag in there. And then you see on each side of the speed bag, you have an arch, right? Right and the left. And so you look at that and you go, and you have to have them do it repetitively. And what you're seeing is motor activity, right? You're seeing muscles contract. And ideally, what you want to see is the arches. You want to see them move in a very symmetric fashion. They're both going to go up. They're going to elevate, right? As you make that sound. That's good, right? When it's symmetric, you want that. You do it repetitively to see if the person has any stamina issues, just in case. But if you have them do the and you see that the arches deviate, so let's say they deviate to one side, they're deviating away from the side of a possible vagal dysfunction. So they actually will, like, it's more like one raises and the other just kind of comes down a little bit, right? And you'll generally see that on one side more than another side. That's a very interesting clue that will tip you off on possible like direct, right? Because of its anatomy and its innervation to those muscles. That's a direct indication that there's a vagal issue. Now, I will say in a healthy population, you don't see that as much. You see the other stuff. All the stuff that evades healthcare is what they're going to tell you about in a history. And that gives you a big clue. But if the vagal dysfunction is more significant and now you're actually having motor problems because of it, you will see this deviation when you do the test. And I haven't seen it in that many clients, but I actually have been surprised how many people that you would consider healthy that have this. And then I have seen it very intensely in somebody that had long-standing vagal dysfunctions since birth. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting to see.
Yeah. So there's a symmetrical component to this system.
Exactly.
That's worth noting.
Exactly. All right. There it is. A little bit, trust me, a little bit on the vagus nerve. But yeah, Tony, we'll have to circle back at some time, revisit some of this stuff, add the interoception. Great topic. And, as we've kind of talked about today, lots of great evidence, interesting things happening in the research world, that I think are, it's going to be exciting, in the years to come to see what comes out of that. So, listen, this would be a good time to remind our listeners that my free neuro masterclass is still hanging out, ready for you to watch. And we've had some really great feedback on it. So if you haven't yet checked out our free neuro masterclass, make sure to do that. Easy way to get in there is to just visit the link in our bio on Instagram. And then you can also visit the link here in the show notes. And I think you'll really enjoy that. And the reason I've been encouraging people to go and watch that is because inside that free masterclass, I teach you a very simple assessment strategy that is really the cornerstone of our entire philosophy, where you can immediately assess your response to any exercise that you are trying. And it's really the best starting place for starting to understand how to use applied neurology, because the goal of applied neurology is to apply something like a stimulus via movement and then immediately know how it's affecting you so that you can make smarter decisions about your training interventions, or, as many people want to do, make smarter decisions about choosing exercises that are actually going to help you decrease pain and move better. So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We'll be back soon. Peace out.